The old man's boots crunched against the frostbitten earth, each step a testament to a heart that refused to break. Elias, 78, had walked 16 miles through the biting November wind, his weathered hands clutching a tattered photograph of a girl with braids and a gap-toothed smile. His daughter, Clara, was all he had left, and today he would see her, so he believed. The road to Willow Creek was unforgiving, a winding scar of gravel and mud that cut through endless fields of dying corn. Elias's knees ached, his breath fogged in the air, but the thought of Clara's face kept him moving. He hadn't seen her in 3 years, not since her husband, Richard, had drawn a line between them with words sharper than any blade. "You're not welcome here, Elias," Richard had said, his voice cold as the winter that followed. But Clara's letters secret, scribbled notes slipped into the mailbox of a kind neighbor had begged him to come. So he walked, driven by a father's love that no distance could erode. By dusk, the small farmhouse came into view, its windows glowing like embers against the gray sky. Elias's heart thudded as he approached the door, his fingers trembling as he knocked. Clara opened it, her face older now, lines etched where laughter once lived. "Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking. But before she could say more, Richard loomed behind her, his broad frame filling the doorway. "What are you doing here?" Richard's voice was a low growl, his eyes narrowing. "I told you never to come back." Elias stood straighter, though his body screamed for rest. "I came for my daughter," he said, his voice steady despite the quiver in his chest. "She wrote to me. She needs me." Clara's eyes darted to the floor, her hands twisting her apron. "Papa, I didn't mean for." "Enough," Richard snapped, stepping forward. "You're a burden, old man. You've got no place here. Don't come again." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in Elias's ears. He stood frozen, the photograph crumpling in his fist, as the weight of rejection settled into his bones. But someone overheard. A boy, no older than 12, crouched behind the woodpile, his breath held tight. Tommy, the neighbor's kid, had been sent to deliver eggs but lingered when he saw the old man approach. His wide eyes caught every word, every tremble in Elias's frame, and something stirred in his young heart, a spark of defiance, a need to right a wrong. Elias turned back to the road, the miles stretching endlessly before him. The photograph was all he had now, its edges worn from years of longing. He tucked it into his coat, his steps slower, heavier, as if the rejection had added weight to his already frail frame. The wind howled, mocking his solitude, but Elias kept moving, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant surrendering. Back at the farmhouse, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she stared at the door. Richard's shadow loomed over her, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "It's for the best, Clara. He's too old, too frail. We can't take care of him." She nodded, but her heart screamed otherwise. She remembered the nights her father had carried her through thunderstorms, his voice a steady hum against her fears. Now, she had sent him away, and the guilt gnawed at her like a hungry beast. Tommy, meanwhile, slipped away from the woodpile, his mind racing. He'd seen Elias before, the old man who waved at him from the road, always with a kind word or a piece of hard candy. Tommy didn't understand everything, why Clara's husband was so mean, why Elias walked so far, but he knew it wasn't right. He ran home, his sneakers slapping the dirt, determined to do something, anything, to help. The next morning, Elias woke in his small cabin, 16 miles away. The ache in his legs was nothing compared to the ache in his heart. He brewed weak coffee, his hands unsteady, and sat by the window, staring at the road that had betrayed him. He wondered if Clara was happy, if she'd forgotten him, if he'd been wrong to hope. The photograph lay on the table, a silent reminder of what he'd lost. In Willow Creek, Tommy was already moving. He'd told his mother about the old man, about the slammed door and Clara's trembling voice. His mother, Mary, listened quietly, her face tightening with each word. She knew Elias, everyone did. The man who'd fixed fences for free, who'd shared his meager harvest with neighbors during lean years. "That's not right," Mary said, her voice firm. "We're going to see about this." Clara's hands shook as she set down her cup. "It's Richard," she whispered. "He says Papa's too much trouble, that we can't afford it." Her voice cracked, and Tommy, standing by the door, felt his chest tighten. He didn't understand money or burdens, but he understood family. He thought of his own grandfather, gone now, and how he'd give anything for one more day with him. Mary leaned forward, her voice soft but unyielding. Clara, you're stronger than this. You know what's right. Richard doesn't get to decide your heart. Clara looked away, tears spilling, but something in her stirred a flicker of the girl who'd once run to her father's arms. That evening, Tommy slipped out again, this time with a plan. He'd overheard his mother talking about Elias's cabin, about how he lived alone, how the winters were hard on him. Tommy didn't have much, but he had a bicycle and a stubborn streak. He pedaled to the general store, using his pocket money to buy a small tin of coffee and a loaf of bread. Then he rode to Elias's cabin, the basket rattling with his offerings. Elias opened the door, his eyes widening at the sight of the boy. Tommy, what are you doing all the way out here? His voice was gruff, but his eyes were soft, curious. I heard what happened, Tommy said, thrusting the tin and bread forward. I thought maybe you'd like these. Elias's hands trembled as he took the gifts, his throat tight. For the first time in days, a small smile broke through his weathered face. They sat together, the old man and the boy, sharing stories over weak coffee. Tommy talked about school, about his dog, about the stars he liked to watch. Elias listened, his heart warming, and told Tommy about Clara when she was young, how she'd loved to chase fireflies. For a moment, the pain of the slammed door faded, replaced by the simple joy of connection. But the road back to Clara was still long, and Elias knew one truth. Love, no matter how fierce, couldn't erase every wound. He looked at Tommy, this unexpected ally, and wondered if hope could be found in the smallest of places. The days grew colder, and Elias's cabin felt emptier with each passing dawn. He woke to the same routine, stoking the fire, brewing coffee, and staring at Clara's photograph, its edges now frayed from his constant touch. But Tommy's visit had left a crack in the wall of his loneliness, a reminder that someone, even a boy, cared enough to act. In Willow Creek, Clara wrestled with her guilt. She'd spent the night after Mary's visit pacing the farmhouse, Richard's snores a distant rumble. Her father's face haunted her, his tired eyes, his stooped shoulders, the way he'd stood firm despite Richard's cruelty. She wanted to run to him, to beg forgiveness, but fear held her back. Richard's temper was a storm she'd learned to weather, but at what cost? She clutched the locket Elias had given her as a child, its tiny clasp holding a faded picture of them together, and made a decision. She would write to him, a real letter this time, not a secret note. But as she sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, the words wouldn't come. Meanwhile, Tommy was relentless. He'd taken to visiting Elias every few days, bringing whatever he could scroungeables from his mother's tree, a scarf his aunt had knitted. Each visit chipped away at Elias's despair, though he never said it aloud. Tommy's chatter filled the cabin with life, and Elias found himself looking forward to the boy's lopsided grin. But Tommy had bigger plans. He'd overheard his mother talking about a community meeting at the church, where folks gathered to discuss the winter ahead. Tommy had an idea, one that felt bold and a little scary. He'd tell Elias's story. The church was packed that Sunday, the air thick with the scent of coffee and damp coats. Tommy stood at the back, his heart pounding, as the townsfolk discussed firewood shortages and road repairs. When the pastor called for new business, Tommy raised his hand, his voice trembling but clear. "It's about Mr. Elias," he said, and the room fell quiet. He told them everything about the 16-mile walk, the slammed door, Clara's tears. Faces softened, heads nodded, and whispers spread. Mary, sitting nearby, squeezed his shoulder, her eyes proud but worried. One voice cut through the murmurs, a gruff, unfamiliar one. "Elias don't deserve that," said Mr. Hargrove, a retired blacksmith who rarely spoke at meetings. He stood, his broad shoulders hunched with age, and told a story of his own. Years ago, Elias had helped him rebuild his barn after a fire, working through the night without asking for a dime. "That man's got a heart bigger than this town," Hargrove said, his voice thick. "We can't let him rot out there alone." The twist was subtle but powerful. Hargrove, a man known for his silence, became Elias's unexpected champion, galvanizing the room. By the next day, a plan was forming. Mary and Hargrove rallied a small group: farmers, shopkeepers, even the pastor to help Elias. They'd fix his cabin, stock his pantry, and, most importantly, bring Clara to him. Tommy, bursting with pride, volunteered to lead the charge. He rode to Elias's cabin, his bicycle wobbling under the weight of canned goods, and found the old man chopping wood, his breath puffing in the cold. "Mr. Elias, you gotta let us help you," Tommy said, unloading his basket. Elias paused, his axe mid-swing, and looked at the boy. For a moment, he wanted to refuse. Pride was a stubborn thing, but Tommy's earnest eyes wore him down. "All right, kid," he said softly, "but just this once." Back at the farmhouse, Clara finally finished her letter. It was short, raw, and honest. "Papa, I'm sorry. I should have fought for you. I'm coming to see you, and this time, I won't let Richard stop me." She mailed it before she could change her mind, her heart racing with a mix of fear and resolve. But Richard found the draft, crumpled in the wastebasket, and his anger flared. "You're sneaking behind my back now?" he shouted, his voice shaking the walls. Clara stood her ground, her voice quiet but firm. "He's my father, Richard. I won't lose him again." The confrontation left Clara shaken but determined. She packed a small bag, ready to walk the 16 miles herself if she had to. But as she stepped outside, she saw Mary's truck pulling up, Tommy in the passenger seat, waving wildly. "We're going to your dad's," Tommy called, his grin infectious. Clara hesitated, glancing back at the farmhouse, then climbed in. The road to Elias's cabin felt shorter with company, but her heart pounded with every mile. When they arrived, Elias was outside, stacking wood with a slowness that betrayed his age. He froze at the sight of Clara, her face pale but resolute. "Papa," she said, stepping forward, her voice breaking. Elias dropped the axe, his arms opening instinctively, and they embraced, tears mixing with the cold air. Tommy watched, his chest swelling, but Mary's hand on his shoulder reminded him this wasn't the end. Richard's shadow still loomed. Clara knew he'd be furious when she returned, and Elias knew one visit wouldn't heal years of distance. But for now, they had this moment, a father and daughter reunited, a boy who'd sparked a change, and a community beginning to rally. Tommy looked at Hargrove, who'd joined them with a sack of potatoes, and saw something new in the old blacksmith's eyes: purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias held Clara's hand, the photograph forgotten for the first time in years. But the road ahead was uncertain, and Tommy, watching from the sidelines, knew their story was far from over. The fire in Elias's cabin crackled, casting shadows on the walls as Clara sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. The warmth of the moment was fragile, like a glass ornament teetering on the edge of a shelf. Outside, Tommy and Mary loaded the last of the supplies: blankets, canned soup, a new lantern, while Hargrove stood watch, his grizzled face unreadable but his presence steady. Clara's voice was soft as she spoke. "I should have come sooner, Papa. I let Richard—" She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the floor. Elias reached for her hand, his own rough and trembling. "You're here now," he said, his voice thick with years of unsaid words. "That's enough for me." But it wasn't enough, not really. The 16 miles between them had become a chasm, and Clara's brief visit felt like a single plank thrown across it. Back in Willow Creek, Richard's anger simmered. He'd found Clara gone, the farmhouse silent, her bag missing. He paced the kitchen, his boots heavy on the floorboards, until he noticed Tommy's bicycle tracks in the mud outside. His jaw tightened. He knew where she'd gone, and the thought of Elias, old, frail, unwanted, stirred a bitter resentment. Richard wasn't a cruel man, not in his own mind, but pride and fear had hardened him. He grabbed his coat and headed for his truck, determined to bring Clara back. At the cabin, Tommy was restless. He'd seen the way Clara's eyes darted to the road, as if expecting Richard to appear. He tugged Mary's sleeve, whispering, "What if her husband comes? He's mad, I know it." Mary frowned, her mind racing. She'd known men like Richard, stubborn, controlling, but not beyond reason. She sent Tommy to fetch Hargrove, who'd wandered to check the woodpile. The old blacksmith returned, his eyes sharp. "Trouble's coming, ain't it?" he said, more statement than question. The twist came quietly, in the form of a stranger. As the group prepared to leave, a woman appeared at the edge of the clearing, her coat dusted with snow. She was middle-aged, her face lined with a quiet strength, and she carried a basket of bread and jam. "I'm Lila," she said, her voice steady. I heard about Elias at the church meeting. Lila was new to Willow Creek, a widow who'd moved from the city after losing her husband. She'd never met Elias, but Tommy's story had struck a chord. She'd lost her own father years ago, estranged by distance and pride, and the regret still burned. I brought these, she said, setting the basket down. And I'd like to help. Elias blinked, surprised by this stranger's kindness. Lila's presence shifted the air, her calm resolve a contrast to the tension brewing. She sat with Clara, listening as the younger woman poured out her fears, Richard's temper, the weight of her choices, the love she still held for her father. Lila didn't offer solutions, only a quiet understanding that made Clara feel seen. Tommy watched, fascinated, sensing that Lila's arrival was more than chance. The rumble of a truck broke the moment. Richard's vehicle pulled up, dust swirling in the twilight. He stepped out, his face a storm of anger and wounded pride. "Clara," he called, his voice sharp. "Get in the truck. We're going home." Clara froze, her hand tightening around Elias's. Tommy stepped forward, small but defiant, but Hargrove put a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head. "Let me talk to him," Lila said, standing. No one expected her to step in, least of all Richard. She approached him, her voice low but firm. "You're Clara's husband, I take it?" Richard nodded, wary. Lila continued, "I don't know you, but I know what it's like to lose family. Elias walked 16 miles for her. Can you imagine that kind of love?" Richard's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. Lila's words were steady, cutting through his defenses. "Clara's not choosing between you and her father. She's trying to hold on to both." Richard looked at Clara, then at Elias, his anger faltering. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this. Lila's story, her own loss. Her quiet regret hit him harder than he expected. He didn't speak, but his shoulders slumped, and he nodded once, a small concession. "We'll talk at home," he said to Clara, his voice softer now. She nodded, her eyes wet, and promised Elias she'd return. As Richard's truck drove away, Elias felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Clara's visit had rekindled something in him, but Richard's presence was a reminder of the fragility of their bond. Lila stayed behind, helping Elias store the supplies, her presence a quiet comfort. Tommy, meanwhile, was already planning his next move. He'd seen the way Lila had changed things, the way her words had softened Richard. He wondered if the town could do more, not just for Elias, but for others like him, alone and forgotten. The next day, Elias found Clara's letter in his mailbox, her words raw and full of love. He read it by the fire, tears staining the paper, and felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He wasn't just Clara's father anymore. He was part of something bigger, thanks to Tommy, Mary, Hargrove, and now Lila. But Richard's shadow lingered, and Elias knew the fight for his daughter wasn't over. Winter tightened its grip on Willow Creek, the fields now blanketed in snow. Elias's cabin stood resilient, its walls patched and pantry stocked, thanks to the townsfolk's efforts. But his heart still carried the weight of Clara's absence. Her letter, now creased from rereading, was his lifeline, promising she'd return. Yet days turned to weeks, and the road remained empty. Clara, back at the farmhouse, walked a tightrope. Richard hadn't forbidden her from seeing Elias, not after Lila's words, but his silence was heavy, a warning of storms to come. She kept busy, tending the house, but her thoughts were 16 miles away. She'd slip out to mail letters to Elias, each word a rebellion against Richard's control. "I'll find a way, Papa," she wrote, her resolve growing with each letter. Tommy, ever the spark, kept the town's momentum alive. He'd turned the church meeting into a movement, with Hargrove and Lila at the helm. They called it the Elias Project, a quiet effort to support the town's elderly, those who, like Elias, lived on the edges, forgotten by time. Lila organized weekly visits to Elias's cabin, bringing food, company, and stories. Hargrove fixed leaks and chopped wood, his gruff exterior softening with each task. Tommy, meanwhile, rallied the kids, turning chores into games, their laughter a new sound in Elias's world. But the heart of the story lay with Clara. One snowy evening, she made her choice. Richard was at the tavern, his absence a rare window. She packed a bag, clothes, a thermos, her locket left a note. "I'm going to Papa. We need to talk when I'm back." She stepped into the cold, The 16 miles daunting but not impossible. She walked, her breath clouding, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and freedom. Halfway there, a truck slowed beside her. It was Lila, her face illuminated by the dashboard light. "Thought you might need a ride," she said, her smile warm. Clara climbed in, grateful but nervous. Lila didn't pry, only drove, her presence a steady anchor. When they reached Elias's cabin, the old man was at his window, his eyes widening at the sight of his daughter. He opened the door, and Clara ran to him, her arms wrapping around his frail frame. "I'm here, Papa," she whispered. "I'm not leaving you again." They talked through the night, the fire burning low. Clara told him everything, her fears, her love, her struggle with Richard. Elias listened, his heart full but heavy. He knew this visit was a risk, that Richard's pride could still tear them apart. But for now, they had this moment, and it was enough. Back in Willow Creek, Richard found the note. His first instinct was anger, but Lila's words echoed in his mind, mingling with memories of his own father, long gone. He sat at the kitchen table, the silence deafening, and realized something. He didn't want to lose Clara, not to Elias, not to his own stubbornness. He drove to the cabin, his hands tight on the wheel, unsure of what he'd say. When he arrived, the scene stopped him cold. Clara and Elias by the fire, Tommy asleep on a cot, Lila stirring soup. It was a family, not his, but one he'd pushed away. He knocked, and when Elias opened the door, Richard didn't shout. "I want to try," he said, his voice low. For Clara, it wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a start. The days that followed were tentative. Clara split her time between the farmhouse and Elias's cabin, Richard grumbling, but not stopping her. The Elias project grew, with more townsfolk joining, their efforts a testament to the power of one boy's voice. Tommy, now a local hero, still visited Elias, his bicycle a familiar sight. Lila became a fixture, her quiet strength a bridge between Elias and the town. One evening, as snow fell softly, Elias sat with Clara, Tommy, and Lila, the cabin warm with laughter. Richard joined them, awkward but present, a man learning to bend. Elias looked at his daughter, then at the boy who'd started it all, and felt something he hadn't in years, home. The photograph, once his only comfort, now sat on a shelf, a memory among new ones. But life is never tidy. Richard's change was slow, and Clara's heart still carried scars. The town's efforts, though strong, couldn't erase every loneliness. And Elias, though surrounded, knew his time was finite. Yet as he looked at the faces around him, he saw a truth. Love, stubborn and unyielding, could outlast any distance, any slammed door.